This class is Theories of Pharmacy Regulation. I'm David Brushwood, a professor at the University of Florida College of Pharmacy. We have 3 learning objectives that we're going to meet in this class. First of all, we're going to discuss theories of regulation that facilitate an understanding of the motivations of regulatory agencies. We're going to try to figure them out. Second, we're going to list the potential threats to success of a regulatory agency. We want to try to figure out what is it that can happen that will cause them to be unhappy that they haven't done things well. And thirdly, we'll describe the steps regulated professions and businesses can take to persuade regulatory agencies that they are in compliance with regulatory requirements. How can we, the regulated, stay off the radar screen of the regulators? So first of all, let's ask this question. Why study regulatory theory? Why not go straight to the nuts and bolts? Why not get to the really important stuff instead of focusing first of all, on theory? Well, I think it's important to study theory because we have to understand them. We who are regulated have different interests than they, who are the regulators, and it's up to us to try to understand them. We can only understand them if we try to figure out what motivates them. We try to get in their heads. We try to live their lives. We try to wear their shoes. And we try to figure out what is it that they need. What are they trying to do? Now it's true. Maybe they aren't as interested in us as they should be. Maybe they should be doing the same thing. But whether they do or don't really doesn't matter. We can only control us and not them. So let's just go ahead. Let me invite you to join me trying to figure out the regulators so that we, the regulated, can be successful with them. We need to succeed, but they hold better cards than we do. They're the ones who are really in charge. And our success has to feed their success. We have to figure out ways that we can succeed that will lead to success by them. Now there's a really important saying, I think it's marvelous. It was taught to me by Kevin McCarthy of PharmCon. I Googled it and can't find the original source of it. It's listed as unknown. Maybe you can do a better job than I can, but it's this. If you can't change the circumstances, then change your perspective. And that's what I'd like to suggest would be the best thing for us to do. There are a lot of strange things that are going on in regulation right now. A lot of unfair things. A lot of frustrating things. The regulators are acting in ways that are really difficult to explain. And one response to that could be to just get angry and to vent and to wish things were different than they are. And anger is a useful emotion. Being frustrated is understandable. There's nothing really wrong with that as long as from that the realization comes that we can't change them. What we can do is change our perspective, and the perspective that we probably should change to is figuring out how we can help them and work with them and show that when they let us meet our goals, we help them meet their goals. How do you realistically expect administrative agencies to behave? Well, there are people who have studied administrative agencies. They've devoted their lives to studying administrative agencies, and they have come up with ideas, with results of studies that they have made of administrative agencies and their behaviors, and they suggested to us 4 ways that administrative agencies may behave. The first of these is very selfishly, the way some people do, guarding their own turf and promoting their own interests. The second of these is completely objectively, based on the facts only, balancing both agency interests and the interests of others. The third possible way that agencies might behave is primarily focused on the interests of others and only secondarily mindful of agency interests. And the third possibility is altruistically in the interest of the public, completely disregarding their own self-interest. Now, what I've asked you to do is be realistic here. And I think probably what we need to recognize is that the last two bullets are idealistic. Sometimes our idealistic expectations are met, and that's wonderful when they are. On the other hand, there are times when we have to be realistic and understand that these last two bullets probably aren't in that realm of realism. So let's look at the first two bullets. What we would really hope for is the second bullet, complete objectivity, balancing agency interests and the interests of others. That would be wonderful. And I think oftentimes agencies do that. Perhaps most of the time they do it. On the other hand, realistically, we have to understand that sometimes agencies operate the way people do. Sometimes. And that is, they guard their own turf and they promote only their interests. The purpose of us recognizing this is so that we can understand regulatory agencies when we see them doing things that are difficult for us to understand, so that we don't overreact to them, so that we sympathize with them, so that we understand that they, like we, are imperfect, that they, like we, at times, need some compassion and understanding so that we can move forward and figure out how it is mutually to solve problems that are goals of each of us. Okay, theories of regulatory behavior. Again, there are a group of scholars who have developed theories of regulatory behavior, and they teach us what they know based on their observations, based on their studies. This is not something that they thought up while in the shower. This is not just pie-in-the-sky ideas. These are theories that result from empirical observations of the world and attempts to explain why it is that the world is the way it is. And we have two basic approaches to the theory of regulatory behavior. On this slide, we have a group of theories called organic theories. And very soon, we're going to look at another slide that has on it structural theories. Now, organic theories are based on the idea that a regulatory agency like the FDA or the Board of Pharmacy or the DEA or the Department of Health is a union of interdependent individuals. It behaves like a group of people working together. Structural theories are different. As you'll see in a minute, structural theories are based on the idea that a regulatory agency is an impersonal organization, that it behaves not like people, but like an organization does. Before we get there, though, to those structural theories, let's look at these organic theories. The first of them is rational actor theory. The rational actor theory is based on the idea that a regulatory agency like the FDA or the DEA or the Board of Pharmacy or the Department of Health is essentially like a business. It establishes explicit objectives. It then chooses among alternatives based on their expected contribution to the organizational goals. It decides, what is it that we can do that will best meet the needs of the organization? And let's look at the inputs and the outputs, and let's evaluate what we might expect to be the best return on the investment of resources and time that we could make. And let's choose to behave in ways that will bring us that best return. The second organic theory of regulatory behavior is called public interest theory. In effect, what public interest theory means is that a regulatory agency functions like a philanthropy. It's a social institution that efficiently performs functions for the survival of society. So it's not self-preservational, it's public preservational. It doesn't work to optimize its own value, it works to optimize the value of everyone, including itself. The third, and very interesting, organic theory is called capture theory. Capture theory is based on the idea that producer groups stand to benefit from protection from competition. In other words, if you are already in the business of pharmacy, the business of pharmaceutical manufacturing, the business of long-term care consulting, whatever business you might be in, then what you would like to do under capture theory is have the regulatory agency that governs you become essentially your alter ego. In effect, you and the industry and the regulator of you, the agency, would be one and the same. And what the agency would do is establish high-level expectations for new businesses, for those who are seeking to enter the market, and effectively act as a barrier to market entry by those who are not yet in the business, leaving to you, the producer group, the people who are already there, full control of the business. Under capture theory, the regulated like regulation. They want to be regulated. As long as the regulations establish a high bar that they can jump over, but newbies can't. And as long as it's clear what the expectations are under those regulations, then regulation is good. There's this idea that the regulated don't want to be regulated. Well, not always the case. If you can capture the agency that regulates you, then regulation is a good thing. That's what capture theory is about. Then there's goal deflection theory. Under goal deflection theory, what you have is an internal group of professional elites who control the group, the agency, for the benefit of that group. So, for example, you might look at the United States Forest Service. The United States Forest Service is controlled, or I believe it to be anyway, by foresters, by people who have forestry degrees and consider themselves to be professional foresters. Now, within the Forest Service, there are also some people called ecologists. They have degrees in environmental studies, but they find themselves not as successful as the foresters do. Many of the foresters view the forest as a product to be cut and sold. Ecologists view the forest as a benefit to be retained. And one might say that within the United States Forest Service, what's happened is decisions are made for the benefit of the forestry profession, not so much for the benefit of the public or for the benefit even of the agency, but for the benefit of the profession. I mean, one could make a similar argument for the FDA, for example. If you look at the people who are in charge of the FDA, what you see behind their name, primarily, is the initials MD. What you see also is that many of the activities of the Food and Drug Administration are geared toward providing value to the medical profession. Not so much the pharmacy profession or the nursing profession or the dentistry profession or the other professions, but for the medical profession. What you could conclude from that is that the FDA has been subject to goal deflection theory in the sense that decisions are being made to promote the medical profession rather than to promote the agency's primary goal, which is to protect the public from unsafe and ineffective medications. Now, a fifth type of organic theory is enterprise theory. Enterprise theory is based on the idea that the purpose of an organization's existence is to continue to exist. And anything that will promote the continued existence of the organization regardless of its other value is a good thing. So things are done for budget maximization. It's said that there is a venal or evil administrator who thinks what I'm supposed to do is gather as many resources as I can from as many places as I can, regardless of whether I need them, and with those resources, continue to support the organization. Lastly, within organic theories is the external signal theory. Here what we have is an agency that defines public interest by controlling data and the message in a feedback loop. By that, what I mean is they do research, and the purpose of their research is to discover that there is a continuing need for the agency's activities. And they publish the results of the research, saying, look, there's a problem that continues to exist, and you need us to solve that problem. So they then get more resources to solve the problem, and many of those resources are used to continue to do research that defines the problem as continuing to exist. So what you have is this feedback loop where the agency says, for example, we have a terrible problem with drug abuse. You need to support us by giving us resources to fight the problem of drug abuse. And many of those resources are used to study the problem of drug abuse and continue to tell the public that there is more need. That's external signal theory. So that finishes our organic theory. So let's look now at a second type of theory of regulatory behavior, and it's called, as a group, called a structural theory. As opposed to an organic theory, a structural theory views regulatory behavior as being determined by the way a group is organized rather than the people who are within the group. And we have three theories that are classified as structural theories that determine regulatory behavior of an agency. The first of these is rationalistic structural theory. In rationalistic structural theory, which is rational from the point of the organization, not necessarily from our point of view, but from the point of view of the organization, you have leaders who are political appointees and they lack the technical expertise of the lifers who've committed themselves professionally to be in the organization for their entire careers. The people at the top are political appointees. And then you have division of labor into groups. Essentially, what you have is an organization that's divided into silos. And these groups, these silos, these offices, don't necessarily talk to each other too much. The coordination of groups is supposed to be done at the top. Unfortunately, though, at the top you have people who don't have the technical expertise of those who are within the silos, within the groups. And what that leads to is the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. So that's one theory of regulatory behavior. Another structural theory of regulatory behavior is called structural inertia theory. Within structural inertia theory, what you have is an agency that has very formalized rules. Not much flexibility, but rules for the sake of rules. Rules are rules, is oftentimes said in an agency that behaves based on structural inertia theory. These formalized rules capture long-term rigidities. So for years and years and years, the agency has functioned in this specific way, leading to people frequently within that agency saying, well, we've always done it that way, as an explanation for why something is being done. and perhaps saying something like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, not realizing that you don't have to wait for it to be broken before you go ahead and improve on it. In the last structural theory we're going to talk about, these are theories of regulatory behavior, why it is that agencies do what they do. We're studying this because we need to understand them. They may not try to understand us as much as they need to, but we're not going to worry about that. We need to understand them. And this last structural theory is called fuzzy output theory. That's probably the most interesting of the labels that we give to these various theories, these 9 theories that we've reviewed, this being the last of them. Fuzzy output theory. And this behavior occurs based on those who've devoted their lives to studying agencies when an agency doesn't really know who they are or what they're supposed to be doing. They don't understand themselves well. If you go to them and say, what is your purpose? They kind of scratch their heads and look at each other and really can't come up with a good statement of purpose. And when you ask them, what results are you trying to produce? They can't say that either. They have difficulty defining their output. They spend a lot of time playing to the crowd. There is a lot of cheerleading that goes on, talking about the wonderful things that they do. But they can't really define those things very well. On the other hand, they never let a good crisis go to waste. Sometimes, because they've had such difficulty defining who they are, they actually, through their ineptness, allow crises to occur. They don't want them to occur, but they just can't help it. They're so indeterminative of who they are that a crisis happens. And man, when a crisis does happen, they say, oh, look at this. This is our reason for being. We're here to prevent crises like this. Now, wouldn't it be better if they actually did prevent the crises rather than using these as an excuse for existing? We'd probably agree it would be, but that's not the way they operate because they can't really define themselves well ahead of time. They wait for a crisis to occur before they define themselves. Now, let's talk about ways in which regulatory agencies address societal imbalance. And we have to ask ourselves, is it inevitable that there will be differences in our society in the quality of diet, education, housing, transportation, healthcare? Is it inevitable that some people will be well fed and others won't be? That some people will be well educated and others will not be? That some people will have adequate housing while others are homeless? That some people will have access to public transportation or perhaps even their own automobile while others will have to walk? Is it inevitable that some people will have good health care and others will have less than good health care? And I think probably we would have to say that unfortunately, regretfully, yeah, that's inevitable. We don't like it, but we recognize the reality of it. And regulation doesn't really exist to equalize things for everyone. It couldn't do that. Regulation does exist to prevent exploitation based on imbalance. It exists to prevent the relative few who would exploit others from doing that. Regulation is for the minority who would exploit other people. It's not for the majority who would do the right thing and not exploit others. And that leads us to telling the story that Garrett Hardin told that he called the tragedy of the commons. It's a pretty simple story, but it's an important one. There was a small town back in the British Isles, and everyone in this small town was happy. Everyone there was a sheep herder. Everyone made an adequate living. There was enough to go around. The sheep were put put out by each sheep herder onto the commons. Nobody owned enough land for their own sheep to use, but collectively there was enough land for them all to have their sheep graze on, and everyone did well. Everyone did adequately. All of them having more or less 50 sheep. 50 sheep was enough to provide an adequate sustenance for all of the families. And then one of the sheep herders had an idea. And he said, you know, if I were to increase just my herd of sheep from 50 to 100, if I were to do that, the commons would support that extra 50 sheep. And in that way, everyone would be perfectly fine. I would just be a little bit finer than everybody else. I would make more money. In fact, I would make twice as much money as everybody else, but everybody else would be fine, even though I'm making twice as much as everyone else. And so he did it. Now, of course, what you, I'm sure, are going to conclude from this is, as soon as he did that, his neighbors looked at what he was doing and they said, well, if he's going to increase his herd from 50 to 100 sheep, we'll do that too. So everybody increased their herd from 50 to 100. And the result, obviously, was that the sheep overgrazed the commons, leading to the tragedy of failure of all of them. All of them. It just took one. All it took was one selfish person to cause a tragedy that led to the demise of all of them. Now, the moral to this story is what we have to prevent through regulation was what's often called the race to the bottom. What we have to recognize is the fallacy of the common good. Not everyone is going to act in the interests of everyone else. Most people will, but not everyone. And what regulation does is it says to those who aren't incentivized to act for the common good, change the way you're doing that. What we want you to do is comply with the rules that everyone else voluntarily is complying with. So the purpose of regulation is to provide vulnerable people with an equal opportunity. It's not to equalize everything for everyone, but to equalize the opportunity for everyone, understanding that when a few people who would abuse the system, not considering the interests of everyone, but considering only the interests of themselves, are allowed to behave in countercultural ways, everyone is harmed. So regulation addresses this societal imbalance. Putting ourselves in the shoes of a regulatory agency, what we need to consider now is some hazards that they face. What are some things that go on with regulatory agencies in their mind? They're important to them that we need to realize are a big deal for them and that we need to respect because we want them to succeed so that we can. First of all, there's a hazard if there are high compliance rates. Gosh, now that seems a little strange, doesn't it? If the regulated are complying at a high rate, what this slide suggests is that there is a potential hazard to the regulators. Why would that be? It would be because society looks at the agency and says, you're unnecessary. We don't need you. So for that reason, what regulatory agencies have to do is constantly look to expand their expectations so that there always is some level of non-compliance. So Non-compliance is the ordinary state of being insofar as a regulatory agency is concerned, because there has to be non-compliance in order to justify the continued existence of the agency. There's also a potential hazard to the agency of the steadily increasing use of financial resources. Society is going to look at an agency that always says, we want more, we want more, we want more. And society is going to say, where is the cost benefit of this additional funding you want? So agencies consistently have to show that they're producing results, that the things that they do are of value to society. Now, a third potential hazard is low public support and respect. Now, when that happens, you have an agency that loses its way, an agency that is not necessarily consistently understanding what society wants. You might have an agency that decides, for example, to ban alcohol altogether, to say alcohol just isn't going to be permitted anywhere within our society. And an agency like that is going to lose public support and respect because the public wants alcohol under some circumstances where it can be safely used, where it can be responsibly used. So when that happens, when an agency is responsible for an activity that doesn't have public support, it's going to lose the respect of the public and become ineffective. How about low compliance rates? When you look at an agency and understand that low compliance rates are a hazard, you understand that the managers of that agency, the directors of that agency, are going to feel vulnerable. They're going to feel like they may be considered dispensable and that perhaps they should do things a little bit differently in order to justify the continued need for them to be at the agency. So that's a hazard. And then you have outcomes orientation, lastly. What if an agency just doesn't even consider the outcomes of what it does? If you have an agency that is doing things that are simply for the sake of doing them rather than promoting good results. What you have there is an agency that's lost its sense of purpose, an agency that really can't say, here is what we're doing that matters, but instead has to admit that it's doing a number of things that don't really matter a great deal. Okay, let's focus on the regulated and acknowledge that there are some regulatory problems that can occur for the regulated. And one of these is in the area of new drug approval. The people who approve new drugs, the FDA, are always in trouble. They're always subject to criticism. Because if they approve drugs too quickly, they are criticized. If they approve them too slowly, again they are criticized. So their job is to make sure that only safe and effective drugs are made available to the American public and that they are used safely and effectively. And it's a regulatory problem for them when there's a drug that is unsafe or ineffective. Another regulatory problem could be with drug labeling. If we have drug labeling that's inadequate, or that's misleading, or that's unclear, regulators say this is something we need to address. And the reason we're looking at these things is because we want to anticipate them and not make the regulators look bad by engaging in activities that bring negative feelings toward regulators. The sales force. The pharmaceutical sales force may encourage overuse of a product under circumstances where it shouldn't be used. And this is a cause of regulatory problems. Prescribers. Prescribers may use drugs that are not in evidence-based ways. They may decide, well, I think I'll just give this drug a try rather than really having any evidence for using it in this way, and that creates a regulatory problem. We have institutional administration, the bosses. And oftentimes, I know this will be a surprise to you, but oftentimes the bosses, the administrators, are bottom line oriented. They're looking at cost savings and trying to figure out not how we can increase quality, but how can we reduce costs. And these are regulatory problems, particularly when institutional administrators become confused and engage in fraudulent activities that provide financial benefits to the institution that are undeserved by the institution. And then we have pharmacists. Pharmacists are regulatory problems. Sometimes pharmacists are underutilized. Sometimes pharmacists are burned out and don't try hard enough. And this is a regulatory problem that agencies have to deal with. And then we have patients. Patients are regulatory problems when they are too patient. Patient in the sense that they are inactive or uninvolved or looking to have somebody do something for them rather than participate in the activity of doing them. So all of these are causes of regulatory problems that we need to begin to understand and try to appreciate and prevent from happening ourselves if we can. Because if we can prevent these, then that puts the regulators in a good light. The regulated have responsibilities to the regulators not to cause these problems. So let's now look at some approaches to regulation. I've listed 5 of them. There are probably more than this, but I've just listed 5 approaches to regulation. These are ways that regulatory agencies can address the responsibilities that they have. Some of them more effectively than others. The first approach is what I call the deity. I am the fount of all wisdom. You follow my directions and don't begin to think about them. The deity is disdainful as a regulator of the regulated, thinking the deity does that the regulated have no real right to participate in the activities that the regulators undertake in order to assure that the regulated are doing their job well. Then there's the cop. The cop's idea is rules are rules. I'm not necessarily going to use my judgment in enforcing these rules. I'm just going to enforce them. Whether it makes sense to enforce them or not, I'm going to enforce them, and I'm going to catch you eventually. One way or another, you're going to make a mistake. And boy, you'll rue the day that you do. Then there's the parent regulator, who is the disciplinarian. The parent who says, the reason I'm doing this is to make you a better person. And I'm going to have to discipline you, but when I do, it's going to hurt me more than it does you. I really don't want to have to do this, but you're making me do it because of your defiance of me. Now, the fourth approach to regulation is the educational approach. The regulator as educator. And the regulator as educator is assistive and says, here's what might work for you. The fifth approach is the colleague who's a collaborator and who says, let's figure this out together. Now, what I'd like you to do is look at these 5 options and recognize regulators really have to choose one of them. What you might say is, well, I think regulators should be all of these from time to time. And there's some value in thinking that, But the reality is, actually, they can't be all of these, and regulators have to decide on which style works best for them. The goal is to be effective. The goal is to be effective. And I think probably most people who are among the regulated, as we are, would look at the last two approaches to regulation and say, this is the way we would like regulators to approach what they do, either as an educator or as a colleague. And that's an important thing to recognize. It's also important to realize that educators can't be effective unless they have hard-working students. And colleagues can't be effective unless they have collaborators with them. So it takes two to tango. We might look at this list and say, the deity just doesn't work, the cop doesn't work, the parent doesn't work. On the other hand, the educator and the colleague, that's going to work. But it will only work if we let it work. We can't say to regulators, you have to be educators and colleagues, without ourselves saying, we will be effective, hardworking students and effective, hardworking collaborators with you in your collegial approach to regulation. Now, let's take a look at solutions to regulatory problems and how it is that the regulators approach what they do. So we, in pharmacy, have a lot of regulators. There are a lot of sources of standards, sources of expectations, people who tell us what they think we should do. And one source is federal agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They have central rules. They're centralized. They're located in the capital of Washington, D.C., or very nearby there. And they tell us generally what they expect for the drugs that we all use and the reimbursement programs that we all manage. Now, the State Department of Health is different because there are different needs in different areas. And state departments of health don't just establish one set of rules for a state, but they can look at individual counties. And they can say within a particular area of the state, here's what's important to us. They're localized. So they develop solutions that are more specific and more workable, and in many ways better informed. Then we have state licensing agencies that determine the parameters of professional practice and the expertise that's necessary to practice a profession like pharmacy, or to be certified as a pharmacy technician. Also, we have JCAHO, the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, which is technically a voluntary organization, but is incorporated by reference in many governmental standards. There are malpractice lawyers. Malpractice lawyers represent people who allege that they have been harmed by some sort of mistake that a healthcare professional has made, that a pharmacist has made, that a pharmacy technician has made. And on behalf of the person they represent, they seek corrective justice to provide monetary compensation to the person who was harmed. The healthcare professions themselves, us collectively, pharmacists, pharmacy technicians as groups, deciding how to regulate ourselves, establishing expectations of ourselves, determining what right and wrong is from a perspective of our group collectively. And then lastly, we have internal regulation that each of us has. And this is probably the most important, and as a regulatory specialist, the most challenging responsibility we have. How is it that we get each healthcare professional to understand It's my responsibility to look beyond myself. It's my responsibility to do good for others rather than only for me. How can I make an individual commitment to standards and regulate myself to do the best that I can do at all times? So let's sum up. What I think we've learned here is that it's necessary to understand regulatory theory so we can put ourselves in the shoes of those who regulate us. We can only be regulated effectively if we understand the regulators. We have to adapt to meet the needs of regulators rather than wishing and hoping that they will adapt to meet our needs. It's going to be a long wait before the regulators say, we're going to develop a better understanding and appreciation of the regulated. It's up to us to make the first move. And lastly, what we have to recognize is that the basic objectives of the regulators and regulated are essentially the same. We're in this together. Regulators and regulated don't need to be adverse to each other. Collectively, we can meet our mutual responsibilities through communication, through respect, and through understanding.